She's not watching the clouds. She's reading a version of the atmosphere you don't have access to, and by the time the sky looks different to you, she's already been responding to it for hours. There's a biological early warning system running in your backyard every time a weather system approaches, built from sensory equipment your own nervous system simply wasn't given, and most keepers walk right past it every time. If you think she's just reacting to what you can already see, wait until you find out which signals she's actually tracking, and what the specific way she responds might tell you about what's actually coming. So what is her body actually detecting before the storm arrives? Why does the whole flock seem to move together as if they got the same message at the same time? And what does it mean when a hen who used to warn you before weather events suddenly stops? When a storm is coming, does your chicken do something you've noticed but never quite been able to explain? Yes, it seems like coincidence the first few times, but behind that shift in her behavior, before the sky even changes, there's something most backyard keepers completely miss. It's one of the most sophisticated environmental sensing capabilities a chicken possesses, running quietly in the background every single day. And if you've been dismissing it as random restlessness, which most people do, you've been overlooking a biological early warning system that's been operating right in front of you. Let's start with what your chicken is actually detecting. She was never just reacting to the clouds. Most people assume it's simple. She sees the sky getting dark, she hears distant thunder. She reacts to what any observer could notice. But here's the thing. The behavioral changes most keepers eventually learn to recognize in their flocks often begin well before any visible weather change is apparent. Sometimes hours before the first cloud rolls in or the wind picks up. If she were simply responding to visible cues, her behavior would change when yours does. It doesn't. It changes earlier. Because the physical precursors to a storm include changes that human senses aren't equipped to detect, but that animal sensory systems are. Barometric pressure begins dropping measurably as a weather system approaches, often hours ahead of any precipitation or visible atmospheric change. Infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, travels ahead of storm systems and can be detected by animals with the appropriate sensory equipment. Electromagnetic field changes associated with approaching thunderstorms have also been documented ahead of visible storm arrival. Research in animal meteorological sensing has documented that numerous species, including birds, show measurable behavioral changes in response to pre-storm environmental cues that precede observable weather by significant time margins. Your hen isn't reading the sky, she's reading the atmosphere through sensory channels that aren't available to you. And by the way, if you've noticed her pre-storm behavior seems more pronounced before certain kinds of storms than others, that pattern is worth paying attention to. We'll get into exactly what it might mean before the end. Barometric pressure is the signal she's most likely tracking. Have you noticed her restlessness beginning on days when the weather still looks perfectly fine from your perspective, only for conditions to deteriorate hours later? Barometric pressure change is the most likely explanation for that timing gap. Here's what most people don't realize. Birds have a sensory structure called the paratympanic organ, located in the middle ear, that functions as a barometric pressure detector with remarkable sensitivity. This organ allows birds to detect changes in atmospheric pressure that are far below the threshold detectable by humans, giving them access to meteorological information that is simply invisible to our sensory system. Research in avian sensory biology has confirmed that the paratympanic organ is functional across bird species, including domestic fowl, and that behavioral responses to barometric pressure changes have been documented in poultry in controlled experimental settings. When pressure begins dropping ahead of an approaching front, your hen's inner ear is registering that change and her behavior reflects it. Not because she understands weather conceptually, but because the sensory input is real and her nervous system is responding to it the same way it would respond to any other significant environmental signal. Her behavioral response follows a recognizable pattern. Does she tend to do the same kinds of things each time a storm is coming, rather than behaving randomly? That consistency is itself significant. A hen responding to pre-storm atmospheric cues typically shows a predictable behavioral sequence rather than scattered, disorganized activity. Increased foraging urgency is one of the most commonly observed early signals, with hens showing more active, focused scratch and peck behavior than their usual relaxed foraging pace. This makes evolutionary sense. An approaching storm means reduced foraging opportunity, and a bird whose sensory system registers that a period of inactivity is coming would benefit from front-loading resource intake beforehand. Studies in poultry behavioral ecology have observed that domestic hens show measurably increased feeding activity in the hours preceding significant weather events compared to equivalent time periods on stable weather days, a pattern consistent across multiple studies and interpreted as an adaptive response to anticipated resource limitation. After the foraging surge, most keepers who know their flock well report a progressive shift toward calmer, more sheltered behavior as the pressure drop deepens and the atmospheric signal strengthens. The urgency of the early foraging gives way to a gradual pull toward the safety of the coop. And if this pattern sounds familiar from your own flock, hit that like and subscribe. It helps us reach more keepers who want to understand the signals their birds are giving them every day. The flock moves together, and that coordination is deliberate. Have you noticed that when your hen starts showing pre-storm behavior, the rest of the flock tends to follow, even if you can't see what started it? That synchronization isn't coincidence. It's the flock's information sharing system working exactly as it was designed. Chickens live in social groups that benefit from coordinated responses to environmental threats. A single hen detecting a pressure change and responding individually would be less effective than a coordinated flock response, in which every member takes shelter before conditions deteriorate. The behavioral cues one hen displays in response to her sensory input, increased foraging urgency, more frequent glances toward the sky, movement toward shelter, function as social signals that other flock members read and respond to, even if those other birds aren't independently experiencing the same sensory trigger at the same intensity. Research into social information use in bird flocks has documented that birds regularly use the behavior of flock members as a proxy for environmental information they may not be directly sensing themselves, a phenomenon called social facilitation of environmental response. Your flock moving toward shelter in apparent coordination before you've noticed any weather change isn't mass coincidence. It's a distributed sensing network, with individuals sharing information through behavior rather than language. She reads infrasound and electromagnetic signals too. Beyond barometric pressure, there are additional pre-storm signals that may be contributing to your hen's behavioral change, and understanding them helps explain why her response sometimes begins surprisingly early. Infrasound, sound frequencies below approximately 20 Hz, and therefore below the threshold of human hearing, is generated by large weather systems and travels ahead of the storm at speeds significantly faster than the storm itself. Birds are known to have sensitivity to low-frequency sound that extends well below the human hearing range, and research into avian responses to infrasound has found behavioral reactions to these frequencies in multiple bird species, including domestic poultry in some studies. Separately, research into animal responses to electromagnetic field changes has found that numerous species show behavioral alterations in response to the shifting electromagnetic environment that precedes thunderstorm activity, with lightning-associated electromagnetic changes measurable well ahead of the storm's visible arrival. While the specific mechanisms and their relative contribution to pre-storm behavioral changes in chickens are still being actively investigated, the combined picture that emerges from the research is of a bird with multiple overlapping sensory inputs, all pointing toward the same conclusion simultaneously, well before that conclusion becomes visible to human observers. What she does tells you which kind of storm is coming. Here's something most keepers never think to track, but find remarkably useful once they start paying attention. The intensity and specific character of your hen's pre-storm behavior may vary systematically, depending on what type of weather is actually approaching. A slow-building pressure change associated with a large, distant weather system tends to produce a gradual behavioral shift, subtle early restlessness giving way slowly to shelter seeking over an extended window. A rapid, steep pressure drop associated with a fast-moving, severe storm tends to produce a more acute, compressed behavioral response, more urgent foraging, quicker shelter seeking, sometimes visible agitation in the flock before most keepers have any indication something significant is approaching. Experienced keepers who track both their flock's pre-storm behavior and the subsequent weather events often report developing an intuitive read over time for what different behavioral profiles tend to predict about the severity and speed of what's coming. This isn't folklore. It reflects the fact that the atmospheric signals driving her behavior do differ measurably between storm types, and her sensory system is responding to real differences in those signals, not to a uniform general storm trigger. When she stops warning you, that also matters. What does it mean when a hen who has reliably shown pre-storm behavioral changes for months or years suddenly stops showing them, with no apparent change in how she behaves before weather events? This is what I set up at the beginning, and it's the part most keepers never think to watch for until they notice the absence. A hen's ability to detect and respond to pre-storm cues depends on sensory systems that can be affected by illness, injury, or aging. Changes to the paratympanic organ or broader auditory system, neurological changes, or significant systemic illness can all reduce the sensitivity or responsiveness of the sensory pathways that drive this behavior. A hen who has lost her pre-storm behavioral response, particularly if the change is gradual and accompanied by other subtle behavioral shifts, may be showing you an early signal of sensory or neurological change rather than attributing simply to personality variation. More commonly, a temporary absence of the pre-storm response may accompany illness or a significant stress event that's disrupting her baseline behavioral expression more broadly. In either case, knowing your hen's normal means that knowing when normal has shifted becomes possible. The storm warning she's been giving you wasn't just useful for weather prediction. It was a window into a sensory system that, when it changes, is telling you something about her, too. She'd been reading the sky before the sky knew what it was doing. You've been standing next to a barometer with feathers this whole time, and the forecast has always been there, if you knew how to look.